I'm Lauren Pierce, 35 years old, and on the night everything quietly shifted, I was standing in a courtyard full of crystal glasses and designer shoes, carefully straightening place cards at a table that wasn't really mine. The Whitfield's vineyard estate in Northern California glowed under strings of soft lights, the air thick with expensive perfume and old stories I hadn't grown up hearing. Behind me, servers moved like shadows, and in front of me guests laughed like they'd never had to check a bank balance in their lives. I was the woman who led clean energy projects across 2 states, but in this house, I was the one people handed their empty plates to without looking up. By the time that weekend was over, I would finally understand that I was never going to be given a place at this table. I was going to have to build my own. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever felt like you didn't quite belong in a room you'd worked hard to walk into, hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. I didn't grow up anywhere near wine country or marble foyers. My childhood was a rented duplex on the edge of a small town in western Oregon with a plastic-roofed greenhouse leaning against the back fence and the smell of damp soil drifting through our kitchen window. My mother, Denise Cole, left for work before sunrise most days, cleaning rooms at a highway motel, and then spending her afternoons in a local greenhouse that never made enough money to put its name on anything. She'd come home with her jeans streaked in dirt and her shoulders burned from the sun, and somehow still had the energy to iron my thrift store school shirts and quiz me on algebra while a pot of soup bubbled on the stove. We didn't have heirlooms or a family crest. We had coupons taped to the fridge, a secondhand computer that whirred like a small airplane, and a woman who believed that learning was the one thing no one could take away from us. I never thought of us as poor when I was little, just always aware that every extra thing in our house had been earned twice over. From the time I was old enough to reach the counter, my life was a mix of potting soil and library books, helping my mom repot basil seedlings in cracked plastic trays, and then spreading my homework across the kitchen table while she soaked her hands in warm water. I learned early how to stretch leftovers, how to patch a leaky roof with whatever you had, and how to turn the free printed handouts from the library into study guides that lived in a shoebox under my bed. When other kids talked about summer camps and beach trips, I learned to tune it out and focus on the one thing that felt like it could open a different door: school. I stayed late for any extra credit, signed up for every free science workshop, and taught myself basic coding from books that still smelled like glue and dust. Somewhere in the middle of all those late nights, a quiet promise settled in my chest. I wasn't going to inherit anything, so whatever I had someday would have to come from my own hands. That promise carried me all the way to the University of Washington in Seattle, where stepping onto campus felt like walking into a different planet made of glass buildings and possibilities. I got there on scholarship and work study, riding the early bus across town to make my shift at a research lab before my first class even started. While some students woke up in dorms their parents paid for, I woke up in a small rented room with a view of a parking lot and counted every dollar of my meal plan. I double majored in electrical engineering and sustainable systems, juggling labs, part-time jobs, and long nights in front of problem sets that made my head ache. It wasn't easy, but every time I thought about quitting, I pictured my mom's hands cracked from years of bleach and fertilizer, and I kept going. That's where I met Andrew Whitfield during a late afternoon study session in a quiet corner of the campus library when the sun was slanting through the windows and turning the dust in the air into something almost golden. He was there with a stack of books on European history and public policy pen tapping against his notebook in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. We started talking when I asked if I could borrow his charger, and somehow the conversation slid from midterms to childhoods, from favorite authors, to the kind of lives we imagined for ourselves. Andrew was soft-spoken and attentive, the type of man who remembered small details and brought you coffee exactly the way you liked it without having to ask twice. He told me his family owned a vineyard in Northern California, said it in the same relaxed way someone else might mention their parents had a big backyard, and I didn't fully understand what that meant until much later. When he finally brought me to the Whitfield estate for the first time, it felt like stepping inside one of those glossy magazine spreads I used to flip through in waiting rooms. The driveway curved through rolling hills of vines perfectly lined like they had never known a bad season, and the main house rose out of the landscape with stone walls and tall windows that caught every bit of light. Inside, there were family portraits in heavy frames, glass cabinets filled with crystal, and a dining room table long enough that my entire old duplex could have fit underneath it. Andrew moved through that world as easily as I moved through a grocery store aisle. He knew every creak in the floor, every name on every wall. I walked beside him, trying not to stare, feeling the distance between the motel hallways of my childhood and these polished floors stretch long and quiet. His mother, Margaret, greeted me at the front door with a practiced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, but never slipped out of place. She thanked me for coming all this way, as if I had been invited to a formal event instead of welcomed into a family home, and her perfume hung in the air like another piece of furniture. His younger sister, Brooke, drifted in a few minutes later barefoot and perfectly put together, eyeing my simple dress with a quick glance that said more than any comment could. The first time we all sat down to dinner together, the conversation circled around charity galas, board meetings, and vacations in places I'd only ever seen on travel shows. When they asked about my mom, I told them she worked in a motel and a greenhouse, and Margaret nodded politely like she was listening to a story about someone she'd never actually meet. Our wedding came not long after graduation, a small ceremony in Seattle, with my side of the aisle filled mostly by coworkers, neighbors, and my mom in a simple navy dress she'd saved months to buy. The Whitfields flew in wearing tailored suits and pastel dresses, bringing with them an ease that only comes from never having to think about the cost of anything. Margaret smiled for every photo, tilting her head just so, but she barely looked directly at me as if I were a detail the photographer could adjust later. At the reception, Brooke walked over to where my mom was sitting with a plate of food and asked in a cheerful voice whether she had made any gluten-free dishes, like she had mistaken my mother for the caterer instead of the woman who had worked herself to the bone to get me there. My mom just smiled and shook her head, but something small and sharp settled in my chest as I watched it happen. I told myself it was just nerves, just different backgrounds rubbing against each other, and that once they got to know me better, the distance would close. Andrew squeezed my hand when he saw the way I tensed, told me his family took a while to warm up to new people, and I chose to believe him because I wanted this new life to work. I tucked away the way Margaret's gaze sometimes slid past me, the way Brooke's questions landed just a little off, like I was always being slotted into the role of helper rather than partner. And as we packed up our gifts and drove back to our tiny Seattle apartment, I had no idea that the feeling from that first dinner, the sense of being present and invisible at the same time, was only the beginning of a much deeper pattern waiting for me at that long, gleaming table. In the first months after our wedding, I thought the distance between the world I came from and the one I'd married into was something time would smooth out. Each visit to the Whitfield estate felt like I was stepping onto a stage already set, with roles assigned long before I arrived. Margaret would greet us at the door with a quick smile, always polished, always composed, and then ease into conversations about wine auctions, renovation plans, or the next charity dinner. Brooke floated through each room as if she had grown up in the very walls, pointing out small details in a way that made it clear she expected everyone else to know them too. I tried to keep up recognizing faces at gatherings, learning the history of old harvests and figuring out which relatives came from which branch of the family. No matter how prepared I felt walking through the door, something shifted the moment I crossed the threshold, like I had stepped back into the quiet corner of a room where no one expected my voice to carry. It was during one of those early gatherings, a summer celebration they held every year, that the first sharper moment landed. The long tables had been set out on the back terrace, each place meticulously arranged with linen napkins folded into crisp shapes. I thought I'd simply take my seat beside Andrew and enjoy the evening. But as soon as we arrived, one of the guests approached me with a friendly wave and asked if I could bring out more salad forks from the kitchen. He said it with a warm tone, one that sounded like he assumed I knew exactly where everything was stored. Before I even had the chance to respond, Margaret stepped into the conversation, thanking me with a small nod, as if I'd already agreed. I walked to the kitchen quietly, not because anyone asked me to do it directly, but because trying to correct the misunderstanding seemed like it would interrupt something larger than I could see. For a while, I convinced myself these moments were harmless misunderstandings, the kind that came from unfamiliarity rather than intention. Still, little things were hard to ignore. At dinner, conversations flowed right past me, moving from vineyard yields to art auctions without anyone pausing to invite me in. When someone asked where I worked, I would answer, but by the time I finished explaining the latest energy project I was part of, they had already turned to the person beside them. The pattern repeated itself so often that I found myself speaking more softly, waiting to see if anyone asked a follow-up question. Most of the time they didn't. There was one memory that stayed with me longer than the others. It happened during another harvest weekend when the courtyard was filled with lanterns and trays of small appetizers. I had stepped to the side to take a break, enjoying a few seconds of quiet, when I heard Margaret's voice just behind me. She wasn't speaking loudly, but the words carried easily in the still air. She was telling a guest that I was sweet, just not quite polished. She said it with a gentle tone, almost affectionate, as if she were describing an endearing flaw. They both laughed softly, and the conversation drifted on before I could gather my thoughts. I didn't turn around. I simply walked back toward the group, feeling my breath catch in a way I couldn't fully explain. When I told Andrew about it later, he looked startled for a moment, then shook his head and said his mother didn't mean anything harmful. He reached for my hand under the table, giving it a small squeeze, and I tried to take comfort in that gesture. It was easier to let the moment slip away than to press it, especially when we were surrounded by people who seemed so sure of the roles we all played. Andrew had grown up in this world. He knew how to navigate every unspoken rule. I hadn't, so I watched and listened, hoping that understanding would come with time. Over the next year, I started noticing how small the chair felt that I occupied in their gatherings. Whenever we visited the estate, I was asked to straighten a centerpiece or make sure the drinks were set out, and even though no one said it directly, the expectation lingered in the air. Once I spent nearly an hour helping reorganize the place cards for a dinner, only to find my own name placed at the far end of the table next to the walkway where servers moved back and forth. I didn't mind the spot itself, but something about the way it happened made me feel like I was meant to be near the edges rather than the center. I looked for Andrew's face across the table, hoping he would catch my eyes, but he was busy talking to his cousin about old classes and recent travels. There were moments when the contrast became sharper, without warning. During one holiday gathering, I baked a lemon tart in the estate kitchen because Margaret always spoke fondly of citrus desserts. I left it on the counter with a small note so the staff would know where to place it. After dinner, Margaret praised the caterers for making the best tart she'd tasted in years. She said it with enthusiasm, smiling wide, clearly enjoying every bite. I didn't correct her. I simply listened as Andrew nodded and agreed, unaware that I had spent most of the morning preparing it. I watched the empty plate being carried away and felt a small knot settle somewhere inside me, something between resignation and understanding. When we were alone later, I mentioned it gently, telling Andrew I had made the dessert. He looked at me with genuine surprise, apologizing for not realizing it sooner. He said he wished he had known so he could have spoken up, but the moment had already passed, and trying to pull it back felt unnecessary. We moved on, at least outwardly, but small memories like that tend to settle quietly in places you don't expect. There were days when the gestures were subtle, so subtle that I wondered if I was imagining them. Brooke would introduce me to someone by saying I had a practical background, a phrase that sounded polite but carried a certain distance. Andrew's Uncle Grant once told me I must feel right at home among the vineyards because of my mother's greenhouse work. He laughed afterward, patting my shoulder, as if his words were meant to be kind. I smiled back, because the alternative calling attention to it felt like it would shift the entire room. During one spring dinner, I found myself helping set the outdoor table with the estate staff, arranging herbs and linen with a patience I didn't fully feel. When everyone gathered, I noticed there was one fewer chair than guests. Before anyone else could, I stepped back and offered to eat inside. They accepted without much discussion, assuming it was no trouble at all. I carried my plate into the kitchen, sat at a small side table, and listened to the laughter drifting in from the courtyard. When Andrew found me later, he apologized, saying he honestly hadn't noticed the missing seat. I believed him. That somehow made the moment settle even deeper. In time, I found myself speaking less during those visits, slipping into a quiet rhythm whenever we pulled into the long driveway. The estate had its own way of shaping how people moved and interacted, and I adjusted without realizing it. I stopped mentioning new projects unless someone asked, and most of the time they didn't. I stopped correcting people when they mispronounced the name of the company I worked with, and I started choosing clothes that blended into the background more easily. None of it happened overnight. It was gradual, like a room dimming slowly from afternoon to evening. One afternoon, after a lunch that felt longer than usual, I stepped out into the garden to get some fresh air. The vines stretched in neat lines toward the hills, and the breeze carried the faint sound of laughter from the patio behind me. I stood there for a while, letting the quiet settle around me, trying to shake off the heaviness that tended to cling after these family visits. It was in that still moment, looking at the rows of grapevines moving gently with the wind, that I realized how much space I had given up without ever being asked to. The thought formed slowly, not dramatic or loud, just steady and clear. Before we left that weekend, I found myself watching the estate from the back seat of the car as we drove down the long gravel path. The house grew smaller behind us, its lights turning soft in the distance. I didn't say anything to Andrew, who was focused on the road ahead, but something had shifted in the space around me. I couldn't name it yet, but I knew it was the beginning of a change I hadn't expected. And as the estate faded from view, I had no idea how much that small moment in the garden would matter in the months to come. The months that followed that quiet moment in the garden felt slower somehow, as if each visit to the estate pulled just a little more space out of the air around me. Nothing dramatic changed at first. The rhythm of family gatherings stayed the same, and Margaret continued greeting me with the same polite warmth she had offered since Andrew first brought me home. But something settled beneath the surface in a way I hadn't felt before. I found myself pausing before I answered questions, waiting to see whether anyone was truly listening or simply being courteous. Most of the time, the conversations drifted on without me moving from recent travel plans to updates on wine distributors, slipping right over my attempts to join in. During one winter visit, we arrived just as the holiday lights were being turned on around the vineyard, casting a warm glow across the courtyard. The house felt full, with relatives arriving from out of town, greeting each other with long hugs and familiar jokes. When we walked into the main room, Brooke glanced up from across the space and waved me over, asking if I could help tie ribbons on the napkins for the dinner table. I nodded and stepped to the sideboard, working quietly, while the conversations filled the room behind me. No one questioned why I was doing it, and I didn't either. It just felt easier to keep busy than to try to find a comfortable place in the crowd. For most of the afternoon, the family gathered in the den, sipping cider and catching up on the year. I stood in the doorway at one point, holding a tray of small appetizers one of the staff had passed to me to place on the coffee table. As I set the tray down, Margaret thanked me without looking up from her conversation. She reached for one of the appetizers, still deep in discussion with her friend, and I stepped back toward the wall, unsure whether to sit or stay standing. Andrew was across the room, laughing with his cousin, unaware of how I hovered near the edge of the group. I listened to the jokes, the shared memories, the familiar rhythm of people who had known each other their entire lives, and I felt the same quiet distance I had noticed before settle in again. There were small moments that made those gatherings feel heavier than they once had. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to refill a glass of water and heard two of the guests talking about how fortunate it was that the estate had so much help during the busy season. One of them nodded toward me, assuming I was part of the staff, and thanked me for all the hard work I must be doing. I didn't correct him. I offered a quick smile, poured my water, and returned to the living room. When I sat beside Andrew, he didn't ask whether anything was wrong. He simply handed me a blanket because he thought the room felt chilly. I appreciated the gesture, but the moment lingered in a different way. At a spring luncheon a few months later, I arrived early to the courtyard, where the tables were being set with fresh flowers and crisp linens. Margaret motioned me over and asked if I could help arrange the place cards. The sunlight made the cards gleam a little, and I placed them one by one in a neat pattern, stepping around the chairs in a slow circle. When I finished, I noticed mine was once again at the far end close to the entrance, where servers would be carrying dishes in and out. Margaret glanced over the table and said it looked perfect, then walked away without seeing how her choices had fallen into their usual pattern. I took my seat when the meal began, listening to the conversation drift across the long table. Andrew was seated several places away, laughing with his uncle about a recent article he had written. He didn't seem to notice where I sat until dessert, and by then the moment had passed. The longer these small patterns continued, the quieter I became during each visit. I found myself thinking more about the work waiting for me back in Seattle, the projects that felt solid and familiar, and the colleagues who knew me for my skills rather than the place I occupied at a table. When someone asked me how a recent project had gone, I answered with a short summary, but the conversation turned before I could finish. I smiled and nodded through the rest of dinner, waiting for the evening to wind down so we could go back to our room and I could shift into a quieter space. Even the small details began to change the way I moved through the estate. I stopped wearing the outfits I once enjoyed, choosing simple sweaters and comfortable shoes that would keep me from standing out. I kept my voice low in conversation, speaking only when someone looked directly at me. I avoided correcting misunderstandings about my work because doing so often required more attention than the moment allowed. No one asked why these shifts were happening, and I didn't volunteer any explanations. Instead, I settled into a rhythm that made each visit feel predictable, even when something inside me felt different. One afternoon stands out clearly, though the moment itself was unremarkable. We were visiting for a weekend dinner, and I had stepped onto the patio to get some air. The vines were still bare from winter, stretching in long, quiet lines across the hillside. I leaned against the stone wall, listening to the low murmur of voices through the open door behind me. Someone laughed at a joke, and another person added a comment that sent the whole room into a new wave of conversation. I watched the sunlight shift across the patio, warming the stone beneath my feet, and I felt an unexpected weight in my chest. I didn't know exactly what it meant yet, but the feeling stayed with me long after we left that weekend. There were evenings in Seattle when I would sit at our kitchen table after work, running through the memories of those visits in my mind. Andrew would ask about my day, and I'd tell him about meetings, site visits, and new developments with my energy projects. He listened attentively, offering supportive comments, but he didn't notice how the estate seemed to take more space than it once had. When he mentioned an upcoming family event, I nodded and marked the date in my calendar, not wanting to disrupt the steady routine we'd built. I didn't bring up the small moments anymore, the missed seat, the mistaken assumptions, the quiet lapses in attention, because saying them aloud felt like I would have to define something I couldn't quite name. One evening, after a particularly long work week, Andrew brought home a stack of old family albums from the estate. He had been sorting through them with Margaret earlier in the day, and he wanted to show me pictures from his childhood. We spread the albums across the living room floor, flipping through images of vineyard seasons, family vacations, and birthdays celebrated under the same patio lights I knew so well. I listened as he shared stories of growing up among the vines running through the rows with Brooke and helping his father during harvest weekends. His face lit up as he talked, and I found myself smiling along even though each page underscored just how long this world had existed without me. Later that night, after the albums had been put away, I lay awake in bed replaying the small memories that had accumulated over the past few years. None of them were large enough to point to directly yet. Together they formed something that felt unmistakably present. Even if I couldn't explain it fully, I could feel the space between where I stood and where the family stood, and how that space seemed to grow with each visit. As spring approached again, the invitations began to arrive for another round of seasonal events at the estate. Margaret sent a warm message about a family luncheon, and Brooke texted Andrew about menu ideas. I marked the dates in my planner as usual, preparing for another trip south. But something about the way I packed our suitcases that weekend felt different. I folded my clothes neatly, checked the weather forecast, and zipped the bags closed, wondering quietly what new moments the visit would bring. And as we pulled out of our driveway and headed toward the airport, a steady thought settled with me, soft, quiet, and still forming. Something was shifting beneath the surface of these family gatherings, and whatever came next, I could feel it beginning to take shape. The spring event that year felt no different when we arrived, but something inside me responded to the estate in a way I hadn't expected. The air was warm, and the hills were turning green again, with the vineyard stretching across the landscape in neat rows that belonged to generations before me. Andrew walked ahead, waving at relatives gathering on the patio while I paused near the walkway to look at the house. It was the same place I had visited countless times, same stone walls, same familiar windows, but the quiet I usually felt didn't settle the way it once had. I followed Andrew inside, unsure what the weekend would bring, yet aware that it already felt different. Later that afternoon, the family gathered on the terrace for a small welcome reception. I stood near the edge of the group holding a glass of sparkling water while conversations flowed around me. Margaret was discussing new decor plans for the study, and Brooke was describing a fitness retreat she had attended the week before. I listened without speaking, keeping a polite smile on my face. When someone asked me whether I had been working on any interesting projects, I began to answer, but before I could finish my first sentence, the conversation shifted toward vineyard renovations. I stopped speaking quietly, lowering my glass to keep my hand still. No one noticed that I hadn't finished my thought. The breeze swept through the courtyard, and I stepped back so I wouldn't block the path of a server carrying a tray of canapés. That evening after dinner, I excused myself from the table when the conversation turned to wine auctions. Andrew didn't look up as I walked away absorbed in a discussion with his uncle about vintage storage methods. I stepped outside onto the patio, letting the cooler air fill my lungs. The vineyard was dark except for the soft glow of lights along the pathways casting long shadows across the vines. I stood there for a moment, looking at the quiet lines stretching toward the hillside. The house behind me hummed with familiar voices, yet I felt farther from them than ever. I leaned against the railing, listening to the muted sound of laughter drifting through the open doorway. The turning point arrived the next morning, though it began quietly enough. Margaret had organized a brunch in the main dining room, and a small group of relatives gathered early to help with preparations. I walked in and found the table already half-set linens neatly arranged and silverware lined up with precision. Brooke looked up from across the room and said, "Lauren, would you mind double-checking the oven? I think something might be burning." Her voice was calm, as if she had simply assumed I was already familiar with the kitchen. I nodded and stepped inside without questioning her request. The trays were fine, and I closed the oven gently, noticing the faint warmth across my hands. When I returned to the dining room, one of the guests smiled and asked if I had brought out the pastries yet. Before I could respond, Andrew's cousin thanked me for helping with everything, then moved on to another conversation. I walked to the window, watching guests arrive along the gravel path. The room filled quickly, chairs scraping across the floor as people settled in. I looked at the table again and saw my place card near the end, the same spot it always seemed to land. I took my seat quietly, smoothing the napkin on my lap. The conversations drifted past me, moving easily around the table. I listened, nodding occasionally, but said little. It wasn't until after brunch that the moment arrived that shifted something deep inside me. Andrew and I were standing near the garden gate when I heard Margaret speaking with a friend behind us. She was talking about how much work these gatherings required and how grateful she was for the extra hands she always seemed to have around. Her friend asked if she hired seasonal staff, and Margaret replied, "Oh, not formally. Lauren's always willing to help. She's very steady." The last word hovered in the air, softened by a gentle tone that made it sound like an observation rather than an insult. I kept my expression calm, but the remark landed in a way I hadn't expected. I looked at Andrew, waiting to see if he'd respond. He didn't seem to have heard it. He was watching the gardener trim a hedge nearby, distracted by the neat rhythm of the shears. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat awake in the guest room with the soft glow from the hallway spilling across the floor. Andrew was asleep beside me, breathing evenly, unaware of the quiet weight pressing against my ribs. I stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the distant rustle of the vineyard in the wind. I couldn't point to one single moment that had brought me there. It had happened slowly, almost quietly, until it reached a place that was impossible to ignore. On the flight home the next day, the cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled above the clouds. Andrew pulled out a book from his bag, flipping through the pages, and I opened my laptop. The screen lit up with a familiar spreadsheet from a long-term energy project I was coordinating, but I didn't look at it. Instead, I opened a fresh document and sat there, hands poised above the keys. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to say, but something had been building for months, and the quiet of the airplane gave it room to take shape. I typed a single line, letting the words settle across the screen without decorating them or softening them. The sentence had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks, waiting for a place to land. I closed the laptop gently and looked out the window at the blanket of clouds stretched below us. Andrew glanced over and asked if I needed anything. I shook my head and told him I was fine. It wasn't untrue. I felt steady, almost centered, not because anything had resolved, but because the clarity I had been searching for had finally arrived. I didn't know exactly what the next steps would be, but the path ahead no longer felt as uncertain as it once had. Back home in Seattle, I returned to my work routine, attending meetings, visiting project sites, and reviewing proposals. The sentence I had written on the plane stayed with me, sitting at the front of my thoughts, no matter how busy my days became. I found myself thinking about the vineyards in a different way, remembering long conversations with colleagues about sustainable agriculture and renewable energy systems that could transform small farms. I thought about the greenhouse my mother kept behind our duplex, how she had nurtured each plant with care, even when the roof leaked and the soil was thin. The idea of creating something resilient and purposeful began to feel more concrete with each passing day. A few weeks later, I reached out to an old colleague, Alex Duggan, who had left our energy firm to start his own consulting group. We met at a small cafe near Pike Place Market, sitting at a corner table with a view of the water. Alex asked what had prompted the sudden interest in agricultural systems, and I told him I was exploring the possibility of investing in small vineyards that needed sustainable upgrades. He listened thoughtfully, asking questions about long-term plans and financial projections. I didn't share every detail of what had led me to this meeting, but the conversation felt more grounded than anything I had experienced at the estate in months. When I walked back to my car afterward, the air felt lighter somehow, as if taking that first step had shifted something larger than I could see. I didn't have all the answers yet, but the direction was clearer than it had been in years. I drove home with the windows cracked open, letting the early summer breeze fill the car. And as the sun dipped low over the skyline, the quiet certainty of what needed to come next settled into place, waiting for its moment to unfold. I spent the next few weeks slipping back into my regular routine, but the rhythm of my days felt a little different than before. I would move through meetings, answer emails, and visit project sites, yet under all of it there was a quiet current beginning to pull in a new direction. The sentence I had typed on the plane remained in the back of my mind, steady and clear, reminding me that something needed to shift. I didn't talk about it with Andrew, partly because I wasn't sure how to form the right words yet, and partly because our conversations had fallen into familiar patterns that didn't leave much room for questions he wasn't expecting. He spent most evenings buried in reading for his classes or reviewing papers for the students he mentored, while I sat across from him at the kitchen table, refining the notes I had started accumulating. A few days after meeting Alex, I arranged a call with a small vineyard owner in northern Oregon who had been struggling with irrigation inefficiencies. We spoke for nearly an hour, discussing soil conditions, energy costs, and long-term sustainability goals. When I hung up, I sat quietly with my phone in my hand, thinking about how natural that conversation felt compared to the moments I spent trying to fit into the Whitfield family gatherings. I reviewed my notes again, slowly forming the outline of what a meaningful first step might look like. The idea of investing in a property felt less daunting than it once had. It felt like something I could shape with intention, with care, with the same persistence that had carried me through years of engineering work. It didn't take long before an opportunity surfaced. Alex sent me information about a 12-acre vineyard outside Salem that had recently been listed at a price far lower than its potential suggested. The property needed upgrades, solar panels, updated irrigation lines, new soil mapping, but the bones were promising, and the soil quality report was stronger than expected. I spent 2 days reviewing every document, reading through the inspection notes, until I could picture the layout of the land. When I finally drove down to see it in person, the air was cool, and the rows of vines were sparse but healthy, stretching across a gentle slope that caught the last of the afternoon light. I walked the property with a notebook in hand, jotting down ideas for improvements, possible harvest cycles, and cost projections. As I reached the far end of the vineyard, the quiet settled around me in a way that felt familiar, almost comfortable. I crouched down to run my fingers through the soil, noticing the texture, the scent, the warmth it held from the sun. Something about that moment made the decision feel simple. I stood, looked across the rows once more, and knew I was ready. By the following week, the offer had been accepted, and I spent the next month traveling back and forth between Seattle and Oregon, meeting with contractors and local workers, mapping out a long-term restoration plan. I didn't tell Andrew about the purchase. He didn't ask where I was going on those trips. He assumed they were related to my renewable energy projects, and I let him keep that assumption. As spring shifted into early summer, my days filled quickly. I built a small operations team with the help of Alex's recommendations, bringing on a logistics planner and an agricultural analyst to help oversee the early stages of the vineyard's transition. I hired a part-time attorney named Ethan Morales to manage the legal side of leases, contracts, and land transfers. Ethan had worked in estate management for years and carried himself with a calm confidence that made each conversation feel grounded. He wasn't surprised when I explained my plan to invest quietly, choosing to keep my name out of the public side of the operations for the time being. "It's smarter than you think," he said during one of our calls. "You'll be able to keep the focus where it needs to be until everything is stable." Back in Seattle, Andrew and I moved through our routines without much change. We ate dinner together most nights, watched shows in the evenings, and talked about our days in broad strokes. He mentioned an upcoming visit to the estate for another seasonal event, and I wrote it on our kitchen calendar. He didn't ask about the faint scent of lavender that lingered on my jacket after trips south, and I didn't offer explanations. It became easier to keep my work life and personal life separate, especially as the vineyard began to take shape under the guidance of the new team. The property's transformation moved quickly. We installed solar panels along the south fence line, replaced outdated irrigation systems, and repaired the weathered storage building at the edge of the property. I visited twice as often as I planned, finding myself drawn to the progress and the conversations with the workers who had spent years caring for the land through difficult seasons. They knew the patterns of the soil, understood how the vines responded to early frost, and offered insights I wouldn't have found in any report. I listened carefully, making notes and adjusting plans as needed. The work felt steady, purposeful, and unlike anything I had experienced at the Whitfield estate. One afternoon, after a long meeting about water usage projections, I walked the vineyard alone while the sun dipped behind the hills. The light caught the edges of the rows, casting thin shadows that stretched across the ground. I breathed deeply, letting the scent of soil and new growth fill my lungs. The quiet was full but not heavy, and as I took a slow step forward, I realized that for the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel out of place. I felt present in a way that didn't require effort. It was a feeling I hadn't known I missed until it arrived. The purchase of the first vineyard created a momentum I hadn't anticipated. With each meeting, each improvement, each decision, my confidence in the direction I was heading grew stronger. I reinvested early returns into a second property, a small aging vineyard outside Santa Rosa that had potential for rehabilitation. This one required even more work than the first, but it also offered more opportunities for renewable energy integration, something I had long hoped to blend with agricultural systems. I established a second branch of the operations team, coordinating with Ethan to ensure the acquisitions remained discreet. He managed the paperwork with precision, keeping the company structure layered and separate from my personal identity. As months passed, the boundaries between my work and these new projects blurred, forming a balance that felt manageable and even natural. I still attended Whitfield family events, with Andrew still sat through dinners and conversations where my voice rarely carried beyond the person sitting beside me. But each time I left the estate, driving back to Seattle or to one of the vineyards, I felt steadier than before. The contrast was clear. In the family gatherings, I moved quietly around the edges. In the vineyards, I stepped into each space with purpose, welcomed by people who cared more about the work at hand than the world surrounding it. One weekend during a trip to the Santa Rosa property, I met with a young winemaker named Mara, who had been working on experimental blends but lacked the resources to expand her production. We talked in the shade of an old pergola, looking out over vines that had weathered several difficult seasons. She shared her ideas with a mixture of hope and caution, and I found myself nodding as she spoke. I wasn't ready to make any promises yet, but her enthusiasm was undeniable. When I drove away later that afternoon, I thought about how many people like her existed, people who only needed a small opening to build something lasting. At home that night, I sat on the edge of the bed while Andrew read through a stack of essays. He didn't look up when I entered the room, offering a quiet greeting as he flipped through pages. I stared at the lamp beside him, wondering how long it had been since we had talked about something beyond logistics or schedules. I hadn't meant for the distance to widen, but the quiet between us seemed to settle deeper with each passing week. I climbed into bed, turned off my light, and lay there listening to the soft rustle of paper as he continued reading. By the end of the year, the operations team had grown enough that Ethan recommended hiring an on-site manager for the combined vineyards. We met in a small conference room in Portland to discuss candidates, reviewing resumes and background notes. When Ethan slid one file toward me, I paused. If you want someone who can manage both the agricultural side and the long-term development plans, he's your best option, Ethan said. The candidate was a seasoned manager with years of experience in vineyard operations and a steady reputation for working well with both teams and landowners. When we offered him the position, he accepted with quiet confidence, ready to begin within a month. For the first time since purchasing the initial property, I felt the structure of my growing project settle into place. Ethan would coordinate the legal and administrative work, the on-site manager would oversee daily operations, and I would focus on strategy and long-term investments. It felt balanced, almost seamless. As the new year approached, Andrew mentioned another family gathering, this time the early spring welcome dinner that marked the beginning of the vineyard's busy season. I wrote the date down, noticing the way his eyes lit up at the thought of returning. He still loved the estate, still carried a deep connection to the land and the memories he had built there. I smiled gently, agreeing that we would go. Inside, the steady resolve that had been shaping my choices these last months grew a little stronger, and as I closed my planner that night, the path ahead felt clearer than it ever had, quiet, grounded, and waiting to meet whatever came next. The Whitfields' early spring dinner arrived sooner than I expected. The morning we were set to leave, Andrew moved through the house with an easy energy humming while he packed his bag and checking the traffic to the airport as if the trip were a welcome break. I folded my clothes quietly, slipping them into my suitcase with a steadiness that surprised me. The vineyards had taken up most of my thoughts in the weeks before, and the contrast between that world and the one we were heading into felt sharper than ever. As we pulled out of the driveway, Andrew reached over and squeezed my hand, excited to see his family again. I smiled softly, watching the city fade behind us. When we arrived at the estate, the sun was still high, casting long, warm lines across the courtyard. Relatives filled the front steps with familiar greetings, and I followed Andrew toward the main entrance. Inside, everything looked exactly as it always had, portraits lining the hallway, vases of fresh flowers on the console table, and the faint scent of the lemon polish the staff used on the wood floors. Margaret stepped into the foyer with her usual grace, welcoming everyone with practiced warmth. She gave me a brief embrace, then moved on to greet another relative. I nodded politely and slipped out of the walkway to let people pass. The afternoon unfolded in its usual rhythm. Guests wandered in and out of the sitting room, sipping wine and catching up. Brooke floated in wearing a soft spring dress, greeting everyone with bright enthusiasm. I found a quiet spot near one of the windows and watched the vineyard stretch out beyond the back lawn. Andrew joined a conversation with his uncle about the upcoming harvest, and I listened from a short distance, keeping my hands folded loosely in front of me. The voices rose and fell around the room in easy waves, familiar and confident. As the sun dipped lower, the group moved outside to a long table set under a canopy of wisteria. The petals overhead glowed softly in the evening light, creating a picture-perfect scene that the estate had always been known for. I took my seat near the end of the table, noticing my name card in the same place it always seemed to land. The servers moved smoothly between the chairs, placing glasses of wine in front of each guest. Andrew sat a few places away, leaning into a conversation with his cousin about a historical text he was reviewing. I watched him talk, his hands moving animatedly, unaware that I was looking. The dinner began in a flurry of conversation. People traded stories about their travel plans, vineyard updates, and small triumphs from the past few weeks. A relative at my side asked if I had been doing any new consulting work, and I nodded, giving a small summary. Before I finished my sentence, someone down the table mentioned a rumored change in vineyard regulations, and the conversation shifted quickly in that direction. I folded my napkin neatly in my lap and listened, letting my thoughts drift for a moment. The steady hum of voices, mixed with the clink of silverware, forming a familiar pattern I had become used to. Halfway through the dinner, one of the guests commented on the wine label, saying they hadn't seen this particular vintage before. Margaret lifted her glass with a smile, explaining that the estate had been experimenting with a few new blends. She said it lightly, unaware of how closely her words brushed against the truth she didn't yet know. I looked down at the label on my bottle, recognizing the design immediately, the quiet rebranding Ethan and I had finalized just a few months earlier. I lowered my glass slowly, steadying my breath. When dessert plates were cleared, a small sound echoed through the patio. A tap of metal on crystal, one, then another. The room quieted instantly. I lifted my gaze and saw Ethan standing under the stone archway leading to the private dining patio. He wore a crisp suit and held a few folded notes in his hand. His presence seemed natural, yet unexpected in this setting. Andrew glanced toward him with mild curiosity. Margaret raised an eyebrow, unsure what announcement was coming. "Good evening, everyone," Ethan said with a calm, steady tone. "Before we conclude tonight's dinner, estate management has a brief update to share." A ripple of murmurs moved across the table. I sat still, my hands briefly tightening around the edge of my napkin. "As some of you know, the estate underwent a change in ownership earlier this year," he continued. "The transition was kept private to ensure a smooth handover, and we're now honored to introduce the principal owner, the person whose vision is behind the improvements you've seen." He turned his gaze toward me in a soft, deliberate gesture. I rose from my chair slowly. The scrape of the wood legs against the stone was quiet but unmistakable. Ethan offered a small nod. "Please join me in recognizing Ms. Lauren Pierce." The silence that followed was absolute. I stepped forward, heels striking the patio stones with a steady rhythm, passing guests whose expressions were frozen in surprise. Margaret's glass tipped slightly in her hand, red wine sliding across her napkin in a slow bloom of color. Brooke blinked as if she needed a moment to understand what she had heard. Grant looked from me to the wine bottle in front of him, as though confirming the label he had admired earlier. Andrew stared at me with a stillness I hadn't seen before, his hand midway to his glass suspended in the air. I reached the head of the table, the one where Margaret usually sat for these gatherings, and turned to face them. I didn't sit. I didn't need to. Ethan set a small microphone beside me, and I lifted it with a steady hand. "You're all still welcome here," I said, keeping my voice clear. "Just like everyone else now." A quiet stirred around the table, the kind that comes when a truth settles into a room without hurry. "There will no longer be legacy discounts, backdoor arrangements, or private shipments," I added gently. "This estate will operate as a working vineyard, and a public one. Your names no longer influence the way it's run." No one moved. Even the breeze seemed to pause. I set the microphone down and stepped away from the table. The pianist near the archway began to play something soft and low, filling the silence with notes that eased the tension only slightly. I walked along the gravel path, each step feeling lighter than the one before. The vines swayed gently in the evening breeze, the lights casting a warm glow across the rows. For the first time in years, my breath came easily unshaped by anyone else's expectations. The sound of the gathering faded behind me as I reached the edge of the courtyard. And as the night deepened around the estate, now mine in full truth, I knew the next morning would reveal a different world for every person sitting at that long, familiar table. The next morning, I walked into the estate's event hall shortly before the cocktail reception was scheduled to begin. The staff moved quietly around me, placing trays of glasses on linen-covered tables and arranging small centerpieces of lavender and greenery. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long lines across the wooden floor, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt no need to step aside or make myself small. Ethan approached with a folder under his arm, giving a small nod before returning to his team. Everything was moving smoothly, and the room carried a calm anticipation that made my steps feel measured and steady. As guests began to arrive, soft music drifted across the space, and the clinking of champagne flutes added a light rhythm to the air. People greeted one another with cautious smiles, their conversations quieter than usual. A few glanced toward me and quickly looked away, unsure how to approach or what to say. Margaret entered with a composed expression, her pearls sitting neatly at her collarbone, though her shoulders held a stiffness I hadn't seen before. Brooke stayed close to her, whispering something that made Margaret lift her chin slightly higher. From across the room, I noticed Grant hovering near the refreshments table, checking his phone repeatedly. When it was time to speak, I stepped onto the small platform that had been set up near the front of the hall. The room slowly settled conversations, tapering into a gentle quiet. I tapped the microphone, adjusting it lightly, as I looked out at faces that had shaped so many years of my life. The lights cast a soft glow across the space, illuminating the row of chairs where the family sat together. I took a steady breath and began. "Thank you all for being here," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Some of you have known this estate for generations, and others have joined these gatherings more recently. Either way, we're grateful you're part of its history." A few polite nods rippled through the room, though most people stayed very still. I clicked a remote, revealing an image behind me, a rendering of the southern fields redesigned with new cabins and a modern wellness center framed by lavender. "We'll be expanding operations in the spring," I continued. "There will be new spaces for guests' upgraded solar systems and a year-round program for local families to enjoy the lake." Brooke straightened in her chair, and Margaret's gaze narrowed slightly as she studied the slide. The next image appeared a stone plaque with my mother's name etched in smooth metal. "We're establishing the Denise Cole Fund," I said. "It will support agricultural workers and their families, offering benefits and community resources many of them have never had access to." The room grew even quieter. Margaret leaned forward as if trying to read the plaque more closely, and for a moment her expression flickered. I clicked again. A new slide appeared, rows of parcel codes and lease terms listed in clear, simple text. "We'll also be reviewing all long-term private lease agreements," I said. "Some were written generations ago and no longer reflect how this estate serves its community." I didn't need to explain further. Grant stared at the screen with a tight jaw, and Brooke lowered her gaze to the floor. Margaret folded her hands together, knuckles lightly whitening as she pressed them. When the presentation ended, soft music resumed, and servers moved through the room offering drinks. Conversations began in low, tense murmurs. People avoided meeting my eyes, unsure whether to approach or keep their distance. I stepped down from the platform and made my way toward the exit for a few minutes of quiet air. Before I reached the door, someone called my name. It was Grant, moving toward me with an expression somewhere between bewildered and frustrated. "Lauren," he said, lifting a hand as if to stop me. "We need to talk about those lease changes." I paused. "You can set up a time with the office," I replied. "They'll schedule a meeting." He blinked, startled. "The office?" "Yes," I said. "They'll make sure everything is handled properly." His mouth opened as if to argue, but I turned slightly, ending the conversation. The lines of vines were visible through the window behind him, arching over the hills in soft, steady lines. Minutes later, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky was turning a deep shade of blue, and the breeze carried the scent of the fields. I walked along the familiar gravel path, feeling the crunch beneath my shoes. The quiet stretched comfortably around me, and the tension of the room behind me faded with each step. The next few days brought a wave of messages. Brooke sent an email titled "Misunderstanding," explaining that her lease had always been handled informally and she had assumed it was grandfathered. She wrote several paragraphs about her good intentions, asking for leniency, and promising to cooperate. I forwarded her message to the legal team without writing anything back. A few hours later, a second message appeared, this time a voice memo filled with the words, "Mistake, confusion, and tradition." I sent it to the State Revenue Office along with the documentation Ethan had prepared. Grant called repeatedly, leaving long voicemails filled with disbelief. "This has to be a mix-up," he said in one. "We're family." His voice carried a tone I recognized well, the expectation of a shared understanding. I listened once, then deleted the message and sent him a formal notice with a 30-day timeline to vacate the leased buildings. When that period ended, the properties were transferred to a nonprofit that offered therapeutic retreats for veterans. They moved in quickly, painting the worn doors and planting flowers along the walkway. The next message came not by phone or email, but by appearance. Margaret arrived unannounced in the lobby of my office. She wore her usual structured blazer and pearls, though her posture held a slight tension. When I stepped out to greet her, she gave a tight smile and asked if we could talk. I led her into the conference room, closing the door behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and began with a practiced calm. "This situation," she said, "is complicated. We need to be mindful of how it appears. Unity matters. Andrew matters." She said his name gently, as if invoking something that would shift my resolve. I reached into my briefcase and placed a sealed envelope on the table. "These are documents from former employees," I said, pushing the envelope toward her. "They detail interactions they had with you." She hesitated before opening it. As she read, her expression softened into something I couldn't quite name. "I didn't realize," she murmured. "They hadn't filed anything officially," I said, "until the estate changed hands and I asked for a review." She looked up, her eyes unsure. "What do you plan to do with this?" "As long as everything stays professional," I replied. "Nothing. But if this becomes public from your side, it will also become public from mine." Her breath caught slightly. She nodded, once stood with a slow grace, and left the room without finishing her sentence. In the days that followed, I didn't feel anger or victory, just a quiet clarity that settled evenly into the space around me. Each message, each conversation, each difficult moment only reinforced what needed to happen next. And for the first time since stepping into the Whitfield world, the weight I'd carried for years began to shift. The only uncertainty left was Andrew. He didn't argue, didn't deny anything, and didn't raise his voice. Instead, he moved through the house in long silences, pausing near doorways, as if searching for the right place to stand. One night we sat on the back porch overlooking the vineyard, the bottle of wine between us still unopened. He asked why I hadn't told him about the acquisitions. I said he had never asked. The stillness that followed stretched long and thin, wrapping around the porch rails and drifting out toward the vines. In the weeks that followed, he packed a few bags quietly and moved into a small rental near the university. There were no arguments or harsh words, only a gentle parting, the kind that comes from years of distance that neither person had fully recognized. 3 days later, I walked outside before sunrise carrying a mug of coffee in one hand. The sky was pale, washed in early light, and the lake near the vineyard was still. I stood on the dock, breathing in the cool air, letting the quiet settle across my shoulders. The estate was changing. The family was changing. My life was changing. And as the first sliver of sun rose over the hills, I knew the next chapter wasn't about them anymore. It was about what I chose to build from here. The morning after Andrew moved out, the house felt unusually still. I stepped into the kitchen, brewed a cup of coffee, and stood for a long moment by the window, watching the sky brighten over the hills. The quiet didn't feel empty the way I once feared it might. It felt steady, almost like the world had finally paused long enough for me to breathe. When I carried my mug down to the dock, the lake was wrapped in a thin line of mist, and the air held that cool sweetness that only appears before sunrise. I sat on the edge of the wooden planks, letting my feet dangle above the water, and listened as the birds began to stir in the trees. Later that day, I walked the vineyard grounds with Ethan moving from one hillside to the next while crews prepared for the greenhouse reconstruction. The structure had been damaged during a winter storm, and we were planning to rebuild it with new solar roofing and better insulation. I told Ethan I wanted to dedicate the space to my mother, to honor the years she spent tending plants behind our old duplex, with nothing but determination and a patched plastic roof. He nodded in quiet understanding, jotting down a reminder in his small notebook before stepping aside to speak with a contractor. The sun was warm against my back as I continued along the rows, greeting staff members who passed by with easy smiles. They knew me now not as someone standing in the corner of a family gathering, but as the person who walked the fields with them and listened to their ideas. That afternoon, I sat down in my office and began drafting a letter to the estate's longtime employees. Many of them had spent decades working under the Whitfields, their names rarely appearing in newsletters or announcements. I wrote slowly, choosing each sentence with care. I thanked them for their dedication, acknowledged their role in building the estate's reputation, and invited them to share memories or suggestions they felt had been overlooked. I closed the letter with my full name, not because formality required it, but because it felt honest to place myself there fully without hesitation. When I printed the stack and handed it to the administrative team, a sense of calm settled around me. A week passed before I returned to the estate's great hall alone. The long wooden table sat empty, polished to a soft shine beneath the tall windows. Sunlight streamed across the chairs where so many dinners had taken place, casting narrow bands of gold across the floorboards. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, not Margaret's usual seat, not Andrew's, but the spot near the window where I had always wished I could sit. I rested my hands on the smooth surface, remembering the years I spent placing napkins, straightening centerpieces, and waiting to be spoken to. I didn't feel the sharp ache I once carried. The room felt balanced, finally matching the weight of the work I had put into changing it. Outside, I could hear a group of schoolchildren touring the vineyard. Their voices drifted in through the open side door filled with curiosity as they asked questions about the irrigation panel I had helped design years ago. Their teacher pointed out the system, explaining how it reduced water use and protected the vines during dry months. I watched them from a distance, smiling as they peered at the panel with wide eyes. They didn't know the years that led to that moment or the history behind the land they stood on, but they would learn about the orchard I planned to plant near the lake and the scholarship program scheduled to open in the fall. When the children's laughter faded down the path, I walked slowly along the length of the table, trailing my fingertips along its edge. My thoughts drifted briefly to Andrew. We still spoke occasionally, sharing updates about friends or a new book one of us had found. There was no anger between us, only space that made room for a clearer understanding of who we had become. Our lives were simply moving in different directions and acknowledging that truth felt kinder than trying to hold on to something that no longer fit. I thought, too, about my mother. Her name was etched into the new plans for the greenhouse and the community programs, and I imagined what she would say if she could see the estate now. She would have walked through these halls with quiet amazement, lingering at each beam and window, pausing to touch the vines with gentle fingers. She never saw herself as someone who shaped futures, but her steady persistence carried me to every turning point in my life. Before leaving the hall, I stopped near the window and looked out at the hills. The rows of vines stretched in soft, even lines, steady and familiar. I stood there for a long moment, remembering the woman I had been when I first walked through these doors, a woman who carried a salad bowl and hoped no one would notice her nerves. She believed that if she stayed quiet enough, helpful enough, she might earn a place in a world that wasn't built with her in mind. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her she was never meant to be small. She was meant to take up space, to build her own life, to plant roots where they could thrive. When I finally stepped out into the open air, the breeze carried the scent of the vines and the soft rustle of leaves. The estate felt different now, not because the house had changed, but because I had stopped asking it to define me. My world was no longer shaped by whether someone offered me a chair or remembered my name. It was measured by the work I was building, the people I supported, and the future I could shape with my own hands. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself after being overlooked or underestimated, I hope my story helps you remember that your worth isn't decided by the people who fail to see it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step forward anyway. If this story resonated with you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to subscribe and stay connected.